The committee will now move to our next witness, Mr. Kalsang Sering, joining via video conference. For the Hansard record, could you please give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Kalsang Sering from Tibetan Communities. Thank you, Chair, and the committee for giving me the opportunity to speak today before the committee. Thank you so much.
It's great to have you. As I said to our previous witness, we do greatly value the perspective of diaspora communities in Australia who are often at the forefront of the targeting by foreign authoritarian regimes through social media. Would you like to make a statement on behalf of the Australian Tibetan community?
Thank you very much. There are about 3,000 Tibetans in all over Australia, and Tibetan communities have been persecuted, and we are not able to freely contact our families back in Tibet. And the most of the Tibetans in Australia are former political prisoners, or their parents or siblings are former political prisoners. So almost everyone, 90% of us have our families back in Tibet. So we cannot freely communicate with them. And WeChat, the Chinese app, which is the only way through which we can communicate. But the WeChat is being a Chinese app, and the Chinese government constantly watch what is being talked and what the communication, even the words, they try to catch the words and try to question the Tibetans back in home. So it is a very big dilemma for us to communicate freely because we were born in Tibet and came to Australia as a second home. So when we want to speak the atrocities that Tibetans are going, the human rights violations, but we cannot freely speak. So, but still, we feel that it's our duty in a free country like Australia to speak about what is happening inside Tibet. But even if we do that, the Chinese governments try to get through our phones or laptops and try to get information about us, and then they try to persecute or question or detain our families back in home. So it is very difficult for us to speak freely here, even in Australia, let alone in Tibet. So Tibetans in Tibet is kind of locked down in so it's everything is locked down. The information from Tibet is not coming freely, and even if someone try to send information or photo from Tibet, they get arrested. Recently in March, a Tibetan woman named Yang To, she I think sent a photo to one of her relatives in India or out from Tibet. So she has been arrested and questioned and detained. So that kind of situation is happening inside Tibet. So that's why we always feel we have to be very cautious while speaking with our relatives or family back in Tibet. And even in free country like Australia, we cannot freely practice the Australian values like freedom of speech, democracy, and also the Chinese are trying to interfere and even try to manipulate and creating disunity among the Tibetans in Australia and the Tibetan exile community. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that opening statement. That is very useful context. There are two issues in particular that I want to pick up from that. One is your statement and observation that Tibetans, Australians feel that they don't have the full freedom of speech and rights in a liberal democracy. That's a terribly sad thing that Australian Tibetans feel that way, and it is the obligation of the Australian government and Australian Parliament to work to fix that, because you have just as much right to participate freely in public debate and our democracy in Australia as any other Australian, and that transnational oppression from the Chinese Communist Party is impacting your ability to do so, I think is a great stain on this country that we must rectify. So thank you for raising that point. Secondly, I want to pursue the issue of WeChat, because that has been a focus of conversation for the committee. There's been a number of witnesses who've raised it, and I'm interested in your observation that it has become very difficult to communicate or connect with family and friends back in Tibet other than through WeChat, and the understandable reluctance of Tibetan Australians to use a platform beholden to the Chinese Communist Party to communicate with their family and friends, given the risk that poses at both ends of the spectrum. It seems clear that there is almost a deliberate strategy to force people onto WeChat for these communications and to prevent these conversations happening on other platforms which are out of the reach of the Chinese Communist Party. Would you agree with that observation, that this is a deliberate strategy?
Yes, I agree that, because even if Tibetans try to Tibetans from Australia or exiled community try to send some information, like for example the speeches and teachings of His Holiness Dalai Lama, and the Tibetans created WeChat groups to listen and listen the teachings and speeches of His Holiness Dalai Lama, and the group who created the group or the people in the group are being harassed or arrested by the Chinese government for such just listening or the teachings of His Holiness Dalai Lama. And also if the Chinese government tried to check the phones of the Tibetans, and if there is the picture of the Dalai Lama, they arrest and detain the Tibetans. So it is very dire situation. And WeChat is only, as I told you, that only the way that Tibetans in exile and the Tibetans in Tibet to communicate. So it's very difficult. The WeChat,
We've had a previous witness to this inquiry today share the evidence that Uyghurs in Xinjiang who download foreign apps onto their phone, like WhatsApp, have been detained and persecuted simply for having those applications on their phone, and that is seen as evidence on the part of the Chinese government of subversion or terrorism and worthy of punishment. I imagine the same restrictions and intimidation applies to Tibetans as well.
Yes, exactly. I don't think that Tibetans who are if someone is very educated or have the information how to download other apps like WhatsApp or Telegram, but I don't think Tibetans have the opportunity, because China constantly watch their phones and even check their phones. So it's very difficult. So what's happening in Uyghur Xinjiang is happening same as in Tibet, because the previous party secretary of Xinjiang, Chen Chunbo, he was he preceded the party secretary in Tibet. So what he applied in Tibet has been applied in Xinjiang. So the situation that today Xinjiang is facing is already faced by the Tibetans. So the policy is being continued in Tibet as well as Xinjiang.
Yes, it is a very distressing fact that Tibetans were used as almost like a testing ground for that kind of oppression, which is now being applied to other minority communities within China. Tibetan Australians who engage in human rights activism, who are critical of the Chinese Communist Party, what experiences do they have online on social media platforms? How are they treated when they engage in that sort of activism?
Yeah, for example, one of the Tibetans in Sydney, he tried to get a visa to go to Tibet to visit his family, and he was told by Chinese that if he stops doing the human rights activities in Australia, then only he will able to get visa. So that's kind of situation is happening. So we cannot even freely practice the values here in Australia, and also, for example, even the Australian politicians and media are not allowed to go to Tibet. So let alone the Tibetans who are doing political activities here. So also one reason is that most of the Tibetans here in Australia are either political prisoners who have been in prison, for like more than 20 years. There are people who are in prison more than 20 years, and some like from like a couple of months to 20 years. So everyone has the experience going through the Chinese repression. So they still fear that if someone from Australia go to Tibet to meet their families, they will somehow, what the Chinese say, instigate things and like create protest or anything, something like in Tibet. So they fear that they don't want to issue visas to Tibet, and they want to like make sure that the Tibetans in Australia, they pledge that they won't do any political activities, human rights activities in Australia, and before and after like getting the visa, they are like they are not allowed to do that. So that's what they oath or pledge before getting the visa. So it is very difficult for anyone to go to Tibet.
Thank you. I really appreciate the insights. I'll offer the call to the Deputy Chair, Senator Walsh.